Chapter 1. The Silence Between Heartbeats. The groan of the aging Land Rover's suspension was the only sound that challenged the immense quiet of the Anatolian plateau. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of diesel, stale coffee, and the unique, sharp tang of anxiety. 4 figures were jostled by the vehicle's tortured negotiation of the terrain, a trackless expanse of ochre dust and sun-bleached rock. This was a place maps forgot, a blank space between forgotten empires. Dr. Kenji Tanaka held the wheel, his knuckles white but his face a mask of placid determination. Every line on his face told a story of summits and depths, of pressures both geological and personal. He navigated the unforgiving landscape with an economy of motion that bordered on ritual. He was a man who believed in process, in checklists, in the steady, methodical conquest of the unknown. It was this belief that had carried him out of the darkness in the Zagros Mountains 6 years ago, alone. This expedition, he promised himself, would be different. This one would be a clean, perfect success. "Satellite pass in 5 minutes, Samira Qureshi announced from the passenger seat. Her voice was clear, cutting through the engine's rumble. She tapped at a ruggedized tablet bolted to the dashboard, her fingers tracing lines of code and topographical overlays. "We're still green on the approach vector. No significant seismic activity. Air pressure is stable. Everything is nominal." The final word carried a sliver of doubt, a concession to the profound abnormality of their destination. In the back, wedged between equipment cases and survival packs, Julian Calloway stared out the window, his eyes devouring the scenery. He was not seeing rocks, he was seeing history. He was a bioarchaeologist of prodigious talent and even greater ambition. His mind worked like a high-speed processor, cross-referencing fossil records with ancient migration patterns and geological strata. It was his theory, his obsessive 7-year quest that had brought them here. He'd found a reference in a fragmented Hittite clay tablet, a pictograph denoting a god-bone temple in a region considered uninhabitable. He'd cross-referenced it with decommissioned Soviet-era resource surveys that showed a massive cavern system with anomalous magnetic resonance. He'd begged, borrowed, and leveraged his entire academic reputation to secure the funding. "Nominal," Julian scoffed, a smile playing on his lips. "Sam, there is nothing nominal about this. We are about to walk into a place that has been sealed unseen for at least 3 millennia. We are about to prove that a pre-Iron Age civilization had the capacity for megastructural engineering. This is the day we rewrite the textbooks." His enthusiasm was a physical force, radiating through the cramped cabin. Beside him, Marcus Cole said nothing. He methodically checked the seals on a Pelican case containing their medical supplies. He was a man of few words and immense physical presence. His past as a combat medic was evident in the calm, precise way he moved, and in the watchful stillness of his eyes. He was here to patch people up, to keep them safe. He dealt in the practicalities of tourniquets and antibiotics, of oxygen levels and core body temperatures. He left the theorizing to Julian and the geology to Lena. Dr. Lena Vogel, sitting on Julian's other side, was a stark contrast to his academic fire. She was the expedition's geologist, a woman who trusted rock samples over ancient texts. She held a gravimeter in her lap, its display a source of constant, quiet concern for her. She was here because the rocks told a story that made no sense. "The resonance isn't just anomalous, Julian," she stated, her German accent clipping the words precisely. "It is impossible. The readings we got from orbit suggest a cavern composed of standard limestone, but with a resonant frequency characteristic of crystalline apatite. It's like finding a bell made of mud that rings like solid steel. It violates the principles of material science." "Science is about expanding principles, not being dogmatic about them," Julian countered, his tone breezy. "Maybe they developed a way to petrify biological structures. A resin, a chemical bath. Imagine the applications." "I am imagining the geological instability," Lena retorted. "A structure under that much internal tension should have collapsed eons ago. Kenji, I want to reiterate my recommendation. We plant remote sensors. We use the drones. We do not establish a deep camp until we have a full 24-hour stability profile." Kenji's eyes flickered to her in the rearview mirror. "Your concerns are noted, Lena, and respected, but Julian's sponsor was very clear. They are paying for definitive proof, not sensor readings. We proceed with caution. We establish a forward base and we assess. Marcus, you have the first watch. Sam, I want a communications check every hour on the hour. No exceptions." His word was final. The truck rumbled on. An hour later, Kenji brought the vehicle to a halt at the base of a sheer cliff face. The rock here was different, darker, almost bruised-looking. A narrow fissure, barely wide enough for a person to pass through, split the cliff from top to bottom. It was not a natural opening. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. "This is it," Julian breathed, practically vibrating with excitement. "The mouth of the mountain." They disembarked, the sudden silence of the plateau rushing in to fill the void left by the engine's drone. The air was thin and cold. There was no wind, not a single bird called out. The quiet was absolute, a pressure against the eardrums. Samira unslung a directional microphone, pointing it towards the fissure. She frowned at her monitor. "Nothing. No wind noise. No animal life. Not even insect chatter. It's a complete acoustic dead zone." "It's a cave," Julian said, pulling on his climbing harness. "What did you expect, a symphony?" "I expected something," she murmured, her unease palpable. They spent the next 2 hours unloading gear, a pyramid of high-tech equipment and survival supplies growing beside the Land Rover. Kenji directed the operation with quiet authority. Ropes were checked, carabiners clipped, headlamps tested. Each member of the team moved with the practiced efficiency of a professional, yet an unspoken tension hung in the air. Julian was a tightly coiled spring of anticipation. Lena performed a final systems check on her equipment with a grim set to her jaw. Marcus scanned the surrounding cliffs, his hand resting near the butt of the flare gun on his hip. "All right," Kenji said, his voice low but carrying in the profound stillness. "This is Point Alpha. We descend, establish base camp Beta at the first stable cavern and proceed with primary exploration. Samira, you will deploy the first comms repeater at the entrance. We maintain a constant link. No one goes anywhere alone. Understood?" There was a chorus of assent. Julian, already at the fissure's edge, shone his headlamp into the darkness. The beam did not reflect, it was simply swallowed. "Let's make history," he whispered. He was the first to enter, clipping his safety line to the anchor Marcus had set. He disappeared into the blackness. Lena followed, then Samira. Marcus went next, and finally Kenji, after taking one last look at the vast, empty sky. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western horizon in brutal shades of orange and red. The passage was a tight squeeze, the rock cold and unnaturally smooth against their clothing. It descended at a steep 45-degree angle. The air grew colder, heavier. The smell of dust and ozone was thick in their nostrils. After 100 meters, the fissure opened abruptly into a vast, cavernous space. They unclipped from the safety line, their headlamps cutting swaths of white through an impossible darkness. "Incredible," Julian's voice echoed in the immense space. "The initial chamber is larger than the surveys indicated, much larger." Lena's lamp panned across the floor, then the walls, then the ceiling far, far above. "The rock here is different," she said, her voice tight. "This is not limestone, the texture, the way it absorbs the light, it's all wrong." She chipped at the wall with her geological hammer. The sound was a dull, flat thud with no ringing echo. She examined the fragment. "It has the consistency of sedimentary rock, but the composition, I don't recognize it." "Sam, get a drone in the air," Kenji ordered. "Full 360-degree LiDAR scan. I want a map of this place before we move another meter." Samira unslung a compact drone from her pack. With a soft whir, it lifted into the air, its own lights adding to the beams of their headlamps. It ascended 50 feet, 100, 200. The cavern was colossal, a cathedral of night. The drone's LiDAR began to paint a wireframe model of the space on Samira's tablet. "There's a large passage at the far end," she reported. "Looks like our route forward. The cavern is stable, Kenji. No signs of stress fractures." "Good, let's move," Kenji commanded. They walked for nearly half a mile through the initial cavern, their footsteps the only sound. The drone flew ahead, a friendly electronic scout in the oppressive dark. As they approached the far passage, a change occurred. The air, which had been still and cold, began to stir. A low, almost subaudible hum vibrated through the soles of their boots. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his head tilted. "Wind, maybe," Julian offered, though he sounded unconvinced. "No," Lena said, her eyes fixed on her gravimeter. "The magnetic field is fluctuating, rapidly, and there's a micro-vibration in the rock itself. Something is causing this." Samira's eyes were glued to her tablet. "The drone is having trouble. The gyros are compensating for something. The comms link is degrading. I'm getting a lot of static." The passage before them was a perfect archway, its shape too symmetrical to be natural. It looked less like it was carved and more like it had been grown. A faint, pale light emanated from deep within. "That's our source," Kenji said, pointing his lamp towards the glow. "We're going in?" Lena asked, her voice laced with apprehension. Julian was already moving forward, his scientific curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "We didn't come all this way to stop at the front door." They proceeded into the archway, the low hum growing in intensity. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence, a physical pressure that vibrated deep in their bones. The light ahead grew brighter, a soft, ethereal luminescence. The air became strangely warm and carried a new scent, something organic and ancient, like dust from a tomb and the sterile tang of ozone mixed together. They emerged from the passage and stopped dead. All of them. Even Julian was silent. Before them lay a cavern so vast it defied comprehension. But it was not the size that stole their breath. It was what the cavern contained. In the center of the immense space, rising hundreds of feet into the darkness, was a structure, a building, a cathedral, and it was made entirely of bone. It was a nightmare of ivory and pearl. Soaring buttresses crafted from what looked like colossal ribs swept upwards into the gloom. Walls were formed from countless interlocking vertebrae. The main spire was a single, impossibly long femur, fluted and carved with intricate spiraling patterns. The entire structure glowed with a soft internal light, a phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the bones. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was utterly, absolutely impossible. Julian dropped to his knees, not in reverence, but in pure, overwhelming shock. "It's real," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the cavern's immensity. "The God-bone temple, it's real." Lena stood rigid, her scientific mind struggling to process the visual data. "This cannot be," she murmured. "The biomechanical stress, the sheer mass. It should be a pile of dust." Samira's drone, which had followed them out, suddenly spiraled out of control. It emitted a series of frantic, high-pitched beeps before plummeting to the cavern floor, its lights extinguishing with a final, pathetic flicker. A small cloud of dust rose where it impacted. "Comms are gone," Samira said, her voice trembling slightly as she stared at the static on her tablet. "The link to the surface. It's completely severed." The subaudible hum intensified, the very rock beneath their feet seeming to thrum with a life of its own. And from the deepest shadows of the bone cathedral, another sound began to emerge. It was not wind. It was not mechanical. It was a low, melodic, and profoundly sorrowful note. It sounded like a song sung by something that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. Chapter 2: The Cathedral of Ivory. The initial shock held them in a state of suspended animation. They stood at the precipice of an impossible reality, their minds scrabbling for a foothold in the familiar world of logic and reason. But the structure before them defied every known principle. It was a monument to a biology that had no place on Earth, an architecture of the grave raised to the level of divine art. Julian was the first to recover, his shock transmuting into a feverish, almost manic excitement. He scrambled to his feet, his pack shedding a clatter of metallic gear against the rock. "Do you see it? Do you see the intricacy? This isn't just construction, it's artistry. Look at the joins, the way the pelvic bones form the archways, the femurs used for the columns. They must be 20 meters long. What kind of creature?" He trailed off, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. He unslung his high-resolution camera and began taking pictures. The flash a series of frantic, desperate strobes against the cathedral's soft, internal glow. "Julian, stop!" Kenji's voice was a low growl of command. He had drawn a powerful, wide-beam flashlight from his pack and was systematically sweeping the cavern, illuminating the cathedral's base. "We don't know what this light is. We don't know what this structure is made of. We don't know what is making that sound. The song continued, a single mournful note that seemed to hang in the air like dust motes. It was a deeply resonant tone, causing the fillings in their teeth to ache. It wasn't aggressive, yet it was deeply unsettling, a melody of profound loneliness. Lena had her multi-tool out and was scraping at the rock near her feet. She ignored the cathedral for a moment, focusing on the immediate environment. The ground here, it's coated in a fine powder, calcium phosphate mostly, bone dust. The entire floor of this cavern is a graveyard. She bagged a sample, her movements precise and automatic, a familiar ritual in the face of the incomprehensible. The phosphorescence, she said, looking up at the glowing structure. It's likely bioluminescence, but on a scale I've never seen. Perhaps a symbiotic fungus or bacteria living in the bone itself. The beckoning light, Julian murmured, remembering a phrase from the Hittite text. A light that feeds on the stone of the gods. He took a step forward towards the cathedral. Hold, Kenji ordered, putting a hand on his shoulder. No one approaches until we have a perimeter. Marcus with me. We scout the edges of this cavern. Lena, Samira, stay here. Set up the portable sensors. I want atmospheric, seismic, and radiation readings, and I want them 5 minutes ago. Marcus nodded, his hand now resting on the grip of a large-caliber pistol holstered on his thigh. He and Kenji moved off to the right, their powerful light beams dancing along the cavern wall, staying a respectful distance from the bone structure itself. Julian chafed at the order but complied, his eyes never leaving the cathedral. He watched as Lena and Samira worked, their professional training taking over. Samira, despite the loss of her drone and the communications blackout, began setting up a local network, connecting their personal communicators and biosensors. At least we can talk to each other, she said, her voice tight. And I can monitor your vitals. Heart rates are elevated, all of you. A natural reaction to a paradigm-shifting discovery, Julian said, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. Lena set up a tripod with a suite of sensors. She watched the readouts on her tablet, her brow furrowed. There's no ionizing radiation, that's good. Atmospheric composition is normal high oxygen content, but the magnetic field, it's not just fluctuating, it's organized. There are patterns in the static, pulses. It's not natural. It's a signal, Samira whispered, looking up from her own screen. The static from the drone before it crashed. It wasn't random noise. It was a data packet, corrupted, encrypted, but it was deliberate. The two women exchanged a look of deep apprehension. The idea that something was not just present, but actively communicating in a way they couldn't understand, was infinitely more disturbing than a simple geological anomaly. Meanwhile, Kenji and Marcus completed a wide circle of the cavern. The space was roughly circular, almost a perfect mile in diameter. The walls were sheer and smooth, offering no other exits. There was only the passage they had come through and the cathedral. The place is a bottle, Marcus said into his communicator, his voice a low burr. One way in, one way out. The entire cavern floor slopes almost imperceptibly towards the cathedral's base, Kenji added, like a massive drainage basin. They rejoined the group, their faces grim. The song from the cathedral had not stopped. It had not changed in pitch or volume. It was a constant, unnerving presence. "All right," Kenji said, addressing the team. "We've seen it. We've documented it from a distance. Now we find out what it is. Julian, Lena, you're with me. We're going to approach the structure. We will take samples. We will not enter, not yet. Marcus, Samira, you are our overwatch. If our biosignals spike, if we stop responding, you get back to the passage. You do not attempt a rescue. You seal the entrance if you can. That is a direct order." Samira looked horrified. "Kenji." "That is the protocol," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We do not risk the entire team. Is that understood?" Marcus placed a hand on Samira's shoulder. "Understood, Kenji," he said, his eyes hard. Julian, Lena, and Kenji began the long walk towards the cathedral. The ground crunched under their boots, a sound like walking on powdered sugar. The closer they got, the more overwhelming the scale of the structure became. The individual bones were colossal. A single vertebra forming part of the wall was the size of their Land Rover. The intricate carvings Julian had seen from a distance were revealed to be a form of script, a complex language of glyphs and symbols etched deep into the bone. "It's a codex," Julian breathed, tracing a symbol with his gloved finger. "This whole cathedral, it's a library, a history written in the bones of its own architect." Lena was focused on the material itself. She ran a portable scanner over the surface. "The density is off the charts. It has the molecular structure of hydroxyapatite, but it's laced with metallic filaments, tungsten, platinum, and something else. An alloy I can't identify. This isn't just bone. It has been engineered at a molecular level." She took her hammer and with a deep breath struck the wall. The sound was not the dull thud of the cavern rock. It was a clear, impossibly resonant chime, like a colossal tuning fork being struck. The note hung in the air, harmonizing with the persistent, mournful song. The entire cathedral seemed to vibrate with the impact, the internal light pulsing once, brightly. From their position 1,000 feet away, Samira cried out over the comms. Their heart rates just jumped. Julian's is over 130. Lena, 125. "We're fine," Kenji said, his voice strained. "The sound, it's disorienting." The harmonic chime was fading, but the primary song seemed to have grown fractionally louder. They were now at the base of what appeared to be the main entrance, a soaring archway formed from the fused pelvic girdles of dozens of the giant creatures. The air here was noticeably warmer, and the song was so intense it was a physical force, pressing on their chests, vibrating in their skulls. It was coming from the darkness within the archway. "I have to see," Julian said, his scientific discipline warring with an almost primal urge to go inside. He took a cautious step into the shadow of the arch. And that's when they saw it. It was not the source of the song. It was something else entirely. Lying on a flat, altar-like slab of bone just inside the entrance was a shape. It was humanoid but grotesquely, impossibly wrong. The body was elongated, its limbs stretched as if on a rack. The skin was pale and translucent, pulled taut over a skeletal frame that had too many joints. Its chest rose and fell with a slow, shallow rhythm. It was alive. But its head was the source of the true horror. It was thrown back, the neck impossibly long, and the jaw was locked open in a silent scream. There were no eyes in its sockets, only smooth, scarred-over skin. It was featureless, a blank canvas of flesh. Marcus's voice crackled over the comms, filled with a sudden, sharp urgency. "Kenji, get back from there. Now, there's something moving on the upper buttresses." Kenji and Lena instinctively looked up, their headlamps slicing into the darkness above the entrance. For a second, they saw nothing but the intricate lattice of bone. Then something detached itself from the wall. It was not one thing, but many. Creatures, the size of large dogs, made of the same ivory bone as the cathedral. They moved with a terrifying, insect-like scuttling, their forms a nightmarish fusion of bone and shadow. They were like white blood cells for the monstrous organism, guardians stirring from their slumber. They were bone weaves. "Move," Kenji yelled, shoving Julian and Lena back from the entrance. "Back to the camp now." They turned and ran, their feet slipping on the fine bone dust. Behind them, the scuttling sound grew louder as the constructs descended the cathedral walls. The mournful song from within the entrance did not change, but it was joined by a new sound, the sharp, clicking clatter of bone on rock, a sound of pursuit that echoed through the vast, silent cavern. They were no longer just observers. They were prey. Chapter 3: The Song in the Stone. Panic is a corrosive agent. It dissolves discipline, erodes reason, and reduces trained professionals to their most primal instincts. The desperate flight from the cathedral was a chaotic scramble, a stark contrast to their methodical, confident approach moments earlier. Julian stumbled, his camera swinging wildly from its strap. Lena, despite her fear, kept her footing, her mind already calculating angles and distances. Kenji ran just behind them, his headlamp beam darting between the path ahead and the pursuing horrors behind. "Samira, Marcus, what do you see?" Kenji shouted into his comm, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "They're fast," Marcus's voice returned, strained but steady. "4 of them, maybe 5. They move like spiders, sticking to the walls and ceiling. They are not coming straight for you, they are flanking." "Status," Kenji demanded. "They are constructs," Lena gasped, running alongside him. "Not biological. Their movements are too precise, too uniform. They are machines." "Machines made of bone," Julian panted, his earlier on now replaced with sheer terror. "The cathedral, it's defending itself." The scuttling sounds were everywhere now, echoing from the cavern walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the creatures' locations. It was a calculated psychological assault. They reached the hastily assembled camp, a small island of technology in the vast darkness. Samira was frantically packing essential gear into a go bag, her face pale in the glow of her tablet. Marcus stood facing the cathedral, his pistol held in a two-handed grip, a small laser sight cutting a steady red dot into the gloom. "They've stopped," Marcus announced. "They're hanging back 100 meters out, just watching." The team huddled together, their backs to each other, a defensive circle of panting, terrified humanity. Their headlamps cut cones of light into the oppressive dark, revealing nothing but the endless floor of bone dust. But they could sense the creatures out there, waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of their beams. The scuttling had ceased, replaced once more by the all-pervading, sorrowful song from the cathedral, and the thrumming vibration of the rock beneath their feet. "The thing in the entrance," Julian stammered, trying to catch his breath. "The body, what was it?" "It was a warning," Lena said, her voice grim. She was looking at her tablet, which was slave to the sensor suite she had deployed. "The vibrations, the song, it's a complex wave pattern. It's not just sound. It's carrying information. It's resonating with the metallic filaments in the bone. The entire cathedral is a massive biomechanical transducer." "Speak English, Lena," Julian snapped, his nerves frayed. "It's a machine that uses biological components, and it's broadcasting something," she simplified, her patience thin. "That thing at the entrance. I think it's what happens when a biological organism is exposed to the broadcast for too long. It's being rewritten." A cold dread settled over the group, far deeper and more terrifying than the immediate threat of the bone constructs. The idea of a violent death was one thing. The idea of being transformed into that silent, screaming horror was another entirely. "We have to get out of here," Samira said, her voice a plea. "We have to get back to the surface." "Agreed," Kenji said, "but we're not going anywhere with those things hunting us. They stopped when we reached our lights. They don't like the direct light." He turned to Marcus. "How many flares do we have?" "6 high-intensity magnesium flares," Marcus replied. "They'll burn for about 5 minutes each, bright enough to turn this cavern into daylight." "Good, that gives us a 30-minute window, enough time to get back to the fissure," Kenji planned. "We pack essential gear only. Samples, data, water, we leave the rest. We move together in a tight group. Marcus, you take point, I'll take rear guard. Lena, Samira, Julian in the middle." They worked with a desperate, silent efficiency, stuffing what they could into their packs. Julian, to his credit, made sure to grab Lena's sample cases and the hard drive containing Samira's sensor data. The awe was gone, replaced by a primal need for survival. The textbooks could wait. "Ready?" Kenji asked, his eyes scanning the darkness. A series of nods was his answer. "Marcus, light the first flare." Marcus pulled a flare from his pack, tore off the cap, and struck the igniter. It erupted with a blinding, ferocious white light, casting the cavern in stark, dancing shadows. The intensity was painful, forcing them to squint. The mournful song from the cathedral seemed to falter for a moment, as if disrupted by the sudden glare. And in the brilliant, artificial daylight, they saw the bone weaves. They were clinging to the cavern walls and ceiling, their ivory forms almost perfectly camouflaged. They were things of nightmare, all sharp angles and jointed legs, their forms vaguely arachnoid but with too many limbs. They had no visible eyes or sensory organs, yet they all turned away from the blinding light, scuttling back towards the shadows of the cathedral. "It's working," Julian breathed in relief. "They hate the light." "Don't get comfortable," Kenji warned. "Let's move now." They began their retreat, a small, illuminated island in a sea of darkness. The flare in Marcus's hand hissed and sputtered, its light a shield against the horrors that waited beyond its reach. They walked quickly, their eyes constantly scanning the periphery. The journey back across the cavern floor felt infinitely longer than their approach. The great bone cathedral receded behind them, its own soft glow looking dim and malevolent in the harsh light of the flare. The mournful song began to swell again, reasserting its dominance as their flare moved farther away. And it was changing. Other notes were joining the first, weaving a complex, discordant harmony. It was no longer just sorrowful. There was a new quality to it, a feeling of hunger. "The broadcast is intensifying," Lena said, her eyes on a handheld sensor. "The wave patterns are becoming more complex. It's reacting to us." "It knows we're leaving," Julian whispered. They reached the archway that led to the initial, smaller cavern. They were halfway to safety. 4 minutes on the flare, Marcus announced, his voice tight. As they passed through the archway, the song from the cathedral was abruptly cut off, blocked by the tons of rock. But the silence that replaced it was not comforting. It was heavy, expectant. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the hiss of the flare. "Keep moving," Kenji urged. They were in the first cavern now, the one where Samira's drone had crashed. The darkness here was more complete, more absolute, without the ambient glow of the cathedral. The flare's light seemed to be absorbed by the blackness, its effective range diminished. 3 minutes, Marcus said. Suddenly a sound echoed from the passage ahead of them, the passage that led to the surface. It was a low, melodic hum, a single, sorrowful note. They froze. "No," Samira whispered, her face ashen. "It can't be." "The song," Julian said, his voice trembling. "It's coming from ahead of us." "That's not possible," Lena argued, her voice shaking. "The rock should block it. It's impossible." "It's not the same sound," Marcus said, his hearing the most acute. "It's higher pitched, an echo almost." Kenji held up a hand for silence. He listened intently. "It's not an echo," he said, his voice grim. "It's a voice. Someone is humming." The blood drained from their faces. There was no one else here. They were the only living humans in this subterranean hell. "Flare at 2 minutes," Marcus warned, his knuckles white where he gripped the flare's casing. "We have to go," Kenji said, his resolve hardening. "There's no other way out. Stay tight. Marcus, get another flare ready." They advanced cautiously towards the source of the humming, their footsteps slow and deliberate. The passage loomed before them, a black wound in the rock. The humming grew louder, clearer. It was a perfect imitation of the cathedral's song, but with a distinctly human, vocal quality. It was the sound of someone trying to carry a tune they had just heard. As they reached the entrance to the passage, the flare in Marcus's hand sputtered and died, plunging them into absolute, heart-stopping darkness. For a second, the only sound was the humming. "Marcus!" Kenji yelled. A frantic scrabbling sound, then another flare erupted, its brilliant light chasing away the shadows. And in the renewed glare, they saw him. Standing in the middle of the passage, not 20 feet away, was a man. He was tall and painfully thin, dressed in the tattered, rotted remains of what might have been a climbing uniform from decades ago. His skin was waxy and pale. His eyes were wide and unfocused, a milky blue. But it was his mouth that was the source of the sound. His lips pursed as he hummed the terrible, alien melody. He swayed slightly on his feet, like a metronome keeping time with a song only he could hear. He was not the creature from the cathedral altar. He was something else, something in between. He stopped humming and looked at them. A slow, beatific smile spread across his face, a smile of serene and utter madness. He was the cantor. "You heard it too," he said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "The music, it's so beautiful. He is building a new choir." He took a shuffling step towards them. Marcus raised his pistol, the red laser dot dancing on the man's chest. "Stay back," Marcus commanded, his voice cracking. The man, the cantor, simply smiled. "There is no need to be afraid. You have been chosen. You are the new voices. You will help us sing the world into its proper shape." He took another step and the humming started again, this time from deep within his chest, a resonant, vibrating tone that seemed to shake the very air. It was the cathedral's song, weaponized, personalized, and delivered by a human vessel. The effect was immediate and agonizing. A spike of pain lanced through their skulls. Julian cried out and clutched his head. Lena stumbled back, her nose suddenly bleeding freely, a dark stream against her pale skin. The cantor was not just a survivor. He was a lure. He was a weapon. He was the next stage of the infection. Chapter 4: The Flaw in the Logic. The cantor's song was a physical assault. It was a pressure wave of organized sound that bypassed the ears and targeted the brain directly. It vibrated in their bones, churned their stomachs, and filled their minds with a dissonant, geometric chaos. It was the sonic equivalent of staring into an abyss. Marcus fought against the wave of nausea and pain, his combat training screaming at him to neutralize the threat. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Last warning, stop," he yelled, his voice strained. The cantor took another shuffling step, his beatific smile unwavering, the terrible melody pouring from him. He was a walking symbol of their fate, a ghost of horrors to come. Kenji made a split-second decision. Don't shoot, fall back, create distance. Killing this man, this victim, felt like a line they shouldn't cross. It was a surrender to the cave's brutal logic. He grabbed Julian by the arm, pulling the disoriented archaeologist away from the sonic onslaught. Lena was already retreating, her hand pressed to her bleeding nose, her eyes wide with a mixture of clinical horror and raw fear. They scrambled back into the main cavern, away from the narrow confines of the passage where the sound was amplified. The pain lessened with every foot of distance they gained. The cantor did not pursue. He simply stood at the mouth of the passage, a silent, smiling silhouette against the harsh light of the flare, his humming a constant, maddening pulse. "What do we do?" Samira cried, her hands pressed over her ears. "We can't get past him." "The flare is almost out," Marcus warned, his voice tight with urgency. "Everyone, get your headlamps to maximum brightness," Kenji commanded, his mind racing. "Focus all beams on him. If the constructs hate the light, maybe he does too." As Marcus's flare died, plunging them once more into darkness, they switched on their headlamps. 4 powerful, concentrated beams of white light converged on the cantor. He flinched, raising a skeletal arm to shield his milky, unfocused eyes. He let out a low hiss, a sound of annoyance and pain. The humming stopped. "It's working," Lena breathed, wiping the blood from her lip with the back of her glove. The cantor took a step back, retreating into the darkness of the passage. He did not run. He simply faded from their view, swallowed by the blackness. The oppressive, humming song was gone. Silence, profound and terrifying, returned. They stood frozen for a long moment, the only sound their own ragged breathing. "Is he gone?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "For now," Kenji said. He swept his light into the passage. It was empty. "He's afraid of the light, that's our weapon, but our batteries won't last forever." "We're trapped," Samira stated, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. "The constructs are behind us and he is in front of us. We are trapped in this cavern." A grim silence fell over the team. The euphoria of discovery was a distant memory, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their predicament. They were in a cage, and the bars were closing in. "No," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. Her mind, now free from the sonic assault, was beginning to work again, to process, to analyze. "We are not thinking clearly. We are reacting to stimulus. We need to reassess the situation based on the new data." "New data," Julian exclaimed, his voice hysterical. "Lena, we were just attacked by a zombie choir boy. The only data I need is the direction of the exit." "He is not a zombie," Lena corrected, her focus absolute. "His physiology, while altered, is clearly still biological. He reacted to light stimulus. He is a vector, a tool of the primary anomaly, the cathedral. The constructs are another tool. They are all part of a system." "A system for what?" Marcus asked, his gaze still fixed on the dark passage. "A trap," Lena said simply. "A biological trap of immense age and sophistication. The cathedral is the lure with its light and its song. The constructs are the shepherds designed to herd prey. The cantor, he is the gatekeeper. He prevents escape." "She's right," Kenji said, his voice low. He looked around the vast cavern, his eyes seeing it in a new light. The sloping floor, the single entrance. This whole place was designed. It was engineered to capture and process whatever wanders in. A fresh wave of horror washed over them, colder and more profound than before. They were not just fighting monsters. They were cogs in a machine. "So what do we do?" Samira asked, her voice small. "We can't fight a machine like that." "All machines have flaws," Lena insisted. "All systems can be broken. The cantor is in the passage. The constructs are in the main cavern with the cathedral. This cavern," she gestured to the space around them, "this is a neutral zone, a processing anteroom. There must be another way, a service entrance, a ventilation shaft, something the original builders used." Julian seized on the thread of hope. A back door, of course. A structure this complex would need maintenance. "We need to search," Kenji agreed, his sense of purpose returning. "But we need light. The flares are our only real defense against the constructs, and we only have 4 left. We use them only for movement. For now, we use the headlamps. We'll have to risk it." He laid out a new plan. They would sweep the perimeter of this antechamber. They would move as a single unit, their lights forming a protective 360-degree bubble. Marcus would take point again. Lena would use her sensors to look for atmospheric changes or structural inconsistencies that might indicate a hidden opening. Julian would search for any tool marks or symbols on the walls. Samira would monitor their comms and biosignals. Kenji would guard their rear, his eyes constantly scanning the dark archway that led back to the bone cathedral. They began the slow, tense process of exploration. They moved along the right-hand wall, their headlamp beams cutting futile gashes in the immense darkness. The rock here was the same dull, non-reflective material. The silence was absolute. Every crunch of their boots on the dusty floor sounded like a gunshot. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in their stomachs. They kept expecting the cantors humming to start again from some unseen crack, or the scuttling of the bone weaves to echo from behind them. After an hour of painstaking searching, they had covered nearly a quarter of the cavern's circumference. They had found nothing. The wall was a seamless, featureless curtain of rock. Morale was beginning to plummet. "This is useless," Julian muttered, his hope starting to fray. "We're just wasting battery power." "Keep searching," Kenji ordered, his voice flat. It was Lena who found it. She had stopped, her eyes fixed on her handheld sensor. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. "The magnetic field, it's different here." The others gathered around her. The wall in this section looked identical to the rest. "What is it?" Kenji asked. "There's a null spot," Lena explained, moving the sensor back and forth. "The background magnetic resonance is gone. It's like a hole in the field, right here." She placed her hand on a section of the wall. Julian ran his own scanner over the area. "She's right. The density is different too. It's thinner here, almost like a veneer." He knocked on the rock. Instead of the dull thud, there was a faint, hollow echo. Their hearts began to beat faster. Marcus moved forward and examined the rock face. He ran his gloved fingers over the surface, his touch surprisingly delicate. "There's a seam," he said, his voice low with discovery. "It's almost invisible." He traced a line in the dust, outlining a perfectly rectangular section of the wall about 10 feet high and 5 feet wide. It was a door, a perfectly camouflaged, sealed door. A surge of adrenaline and hope shot through the group. They had found it, a back door, a way out. There was no handle, no visible mechanism. Julian and Lena scanned it, searching for a clue. "There are microfilaments embedded in the seam," Julian said. "It might be a pressure lock." "Let me try," Marcus said. He braced his feet and placed his hands flat on the door. He pushed. Nothing happened. He pushed harder, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching. The door remained immobile. "It's no good," he grunted, stepping back. "It's sealed tight." "There has to be a way," Samira insisted. It was then that Lena noticed something else. A small, almost invisible glyph carved into the rock just beside the door's seam. It was not the elegant, flowing script of the bone cathedral. It was jagged, asymmetrical, and insect-like. "Julian, look at this," she said. Julian leaned in, his light focused on the small symbol. He stared at it for a long moment. "I've never seen this before," he said. "It's not the language from the cathedral, it's something else entirely." He pulled out his camera and took a high-resolution photo. As the camera's flash illuminated the glyph, a low grinding sound echoed from the door. A vertical crack of absolute blackness appeared in the seam. The door was opening. A wave of disbelief and elation washed over them. "The flash," Julian whispered in amazement. "It's light-activated. A specific wavelength, maybe." The door slowly, silently, slid sideways into the wall, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. A new smell wafted out, different from the rest of the cave. It was a sharp, sterile, chitinous scent, like the inside of an ant's nest. For a moment they were too stunned to move. They had found a way out. They had beaten the trap. "We need to go now," Kenji said, finding his voice, "before anything realizes what we've done." But as he spoke, Lena, who was staring at the new passage with her sensor, let out a small gasp. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. "What is it, Lena?" Kenji asked, turning to her. She held up her sensor for him to see. "The material composition," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The walls of this new tunnel, they're not rock." She shone her light into the passage. The walls were not the dull gray of the cavern. They were a deep, glossy black, covered in sharp, geometric patterns. They looked like the carapace of a giant insect. Lying on the floor just inside the new passage was a single, bleached white object. It was a bone, a vertebra to be precise. It was fluted, elegant, and ivory-like. It was a bone from one of the creatures that had built the first cathedral. The horrible, impossible truth crashed down on them. This was not a back door. This was not an exit. It was the entrance to the next exhibit. Chapter 5: The Chitinous Nave. The silence that followed Lena's discovery was a physical weight. Hope, which had soared moments before, now lay shattered on the cavern floor. The open doorway was not a path to salvation. It was a deeper circle of hell. The single ivory vertebra lying just inside the black, chitinous tunnel was a statement, a piece of cosmic punctuation that rearranged their entire understanding of the nightmare. "No," Julian whispered, shaking his head in denial. "It can't be. It's a different architectural style, a different language. They can't both be here." But even as he said it, his scientific mind was connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The two distinct scripts, the two impossible structures, the cyclical nature of a trap. "It's a different church," Lena stated, her voice flat with a terrifying certainty. "Built by a different species, or for a different species." "What does that mean?" Samira asked, her voice trembling. "It means the trap is older and more complex than we imagined," Kenji answered, his gaze fixed on the dark passage. He understood the strategic implication immediately. "It means this place has claimed others before us, others who were not human." The full weight of their situation settled upon them. They were not the first intelligent life to stumble into this galactic prison. The Luminarchitects, the builders of the beautiful ivory cathedral, had also been caught. They had found their own back door, only to be led into another, older trap. It was a maze with no exit, where each chamber was a monument to the last race that had failed to escape. A low, guttural chittering sound echoed from deep within the new passage, a sound like 1,000 insects rubbing their legs together. It was followed by a sharp, acrid smell that made their eyes water. "Close the door," Marcus said, his voice a low growl. He was already moving, placing his hands on the edge of the massive stone slab. "Now." Julian jolted into action, aimed his camera at the glyph and fired the flash again. With a deep groan, the hidden door began to slide shut, but before it could close completely, something shot out of the darkness of the new passage. It was a long, black, whip-like appendage, tipped with a razor-sharp barb. It moved with blinding speed, striking the stone floor where Samira had been standing a second before. Marcus had yanked her back just in time. The appendage retracted as the door sealed with a final, booming thud, leaving a deep gouge in the cavern floor. They stared at the mark, their hearts hammering. "What was that?" Julian gasped. "A welcome party," Marcus said grimly. They were back in the antechamber, the way forward now blocked by a new and more aggressive horror, the way back still guarded by the cantor and the bone weaves. The walls were closing in, literally and figuratively. "We are not going in there," Samira said, her voice shaking with conviction. "I don't care what happens, we are not going into that other place." "Our options are limited," Kenji said, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. "We have the constructs behind us and whatever that was in front of us, and we still have the cantor in the main passage." He paused, his eyes sweeping over his terrified team. "There is one other possibility." "What?" Julian asked, desperate. "The cantor is afraid of light. The constructs are afraid of light. What if we use it not just as a shield but as a weapon? A sustained, overwhelming flood of light." "The flares," Lena realized. "You want to use all of them at once." "Exactly," Kenji confirmed. 4 flares. We light them all. It will create a moving zone of daylight so intense it should drive back any of these things. It will give us a 15, maybe 20-minute window of overwhelming superiority. Enough time to get past the cantor and up the fissure to the surface. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. It would exhaust their most powerful defensive tool. If it failed, they would be left in the dark, defenseless. "It's our only chance," Marcus said, his hand resting on the flares in his pack. "I'd rather face that humming freak in the light than whatever that tentacle belonged to in the dark." The decision was made. The grim finality of it settled over them. They huddled together, preparing for the final, desperate run. Kenji gave the orders, his voice low and steady, a calming anchor in the storm of their fear. "Marcus, Yumi, Julian, Lena, we each take a flare. Samira, you have no flare, so you stay in the absolute center of the group. We light them on my mark. We move fast and we do not stop for anything. We run through the cantor if we have to. We do not engage, we just move. Straight for the exit passage. Clear." They all nodded, their faces grim and determined in the beams of their headlamps. This was it, their one shot at escape. "Ready?" Kenji asked. They all held their flares, their thumbs on the igniters. "Mark." 4 simultaneous clicks and the cavern erupted in a firestorm of pure white light. The intensity was staggering, a physical blow. The darkness was not just banished, it was annihilated. Every corner of the vast antechamber was revealed in perfect, stark detail. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was visible. And they saw that they were not alone. Clinging to the ceiling, caught in the sudden, brutal glare, were more of the bone-weave constructs, dozens of them. They had been silently stalking them from above the entire time. They hissed and recoiled from the light, scuttling back towards the dark archway of the bone cathedral, a tide of ivory nightmares receding from the shore of light. At the same time, a furious, frustrated chittering came from behind the newly sealed door to the second church. The stone itself vibrated with the angry sounds of the creatures trapped within. The plan was working. The light was their salvation. "Go!" Kenji yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flares. They ran, a phalanx of light and desperation, straight for the main exit passage. The heat from the 4 flares was intense, searing their faces. The ground flew by beneath their feet. They reached the passage where the cantor had appeared. It was empty. The overwhelming light had driven him deep into the mountain. They plunged into the fissure, the light from their flares reflecting off the smooth, dark walls, turning the narrow space into a tunnel of fire. They scrambled upwards, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. They did not dare to look back. The climb seemed to take an eternity, but finally they saw it, a sliver of pale gray light high above them, the surface, the real world. With a final, desperate burst of energy, they clawed their way up the last section of the fissure and tumbled out onto the dusty, rocky ground of the Anatolian plateau. They collapsed in a heap, gasping for air, their bodies screaming with exertion, their minds shattered. They were out, they had made it. The flares hissed and died one by one, plunging them into the soft, gentle light of pre-dawn. The silence of the plateau was a blessing, a balm on their frayed nerves. For a long moment they just lay there, breathing in the cold, clean air, letting the reality of their escape wash over them. It was Julian who spoke first, his voice choked with a mixture of relief and residual terror. "We did it," he whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. "We actually did it." But Lena was not celebrating. She had pushed herself up and was staring at the fissure, her face a mask of horror. In the soft morning light, something was visible that had been hidden by the darkness and the glare of the flares. Carved into the rock all around the fissure's entrance, covering every available surface, were symbols, thousands of them. And they were not the elegant script of the Lumen architects, nor the jagged glyphs of the chitinous geometers. They were human. There were crude crosses, stars of David, Islamic crescents. There were scientific symbols, the double helix of DNA, the Bohr model of the atom. There were handprints, and there were names. Hundreds of names scratched into the rock with desperate, dying hands. The Franklin Expedition, 1847. P. Fawcett, 1925. Amelia Earhart, 1937. Soviet Geophysical Survey Team 7, 1971. It was a guest book of the damned, a record of all the other humans who had found this place, who had been trapped, and who had inevitably been led to build the next church in the cycle. Kenji's eyes fell upon one set of names, freshly scratched near the bottom. The Zagros recovery team 6 years ago. His team, the one he thought he had escaped, the one he thought had been lost to a simple cave-in. The horrible truth dawned on him. He hadn't survived. He had just been let out. He was their cantor. His obsession with returning to the deep places of the earth, his drive to lead this new expedition. It wasn't his own. It was a compulsion, a homing signal. And as this realization crashed over him, he saw the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. At the base of the cliff, tucked away in the shadows, was their Land Rover, and beside it was a second, older vehicle, a rusted, vine-covered truck with Cyrillic lettering on its door, the truck from the 1971 Soviet survey. And beside that was a pile of rotted leather and brass, the remains of a 19th century explorer's kit. This was not an exit, it was the entrance, a carefully curated staging area reset for each new group of victims. A low, melodic humming began to drift up from the fissure behind them. The song of the cantor, their cantor. It was faint, but it was growing. It was time for the next performance to begin. Chapter 6: The Echo in the Blood. The world had shrunk to the space between heartbeats. The vast Anatolian plateau, the promise of an open sky, the very concept of escape, all of it dissolved into a cruel theatrical backdrop. They were rats in a maze who had found the exit, only to discover it was a painted wall leading back to the starting line. The air, once a symbol of freedom, now tasted of ash and finality. Kenji Tanaka was on his knees, his hands clawing at the rocky ground. The names, the dates, they were not just historical records, they were echoes in his own blood. The Zagros recovery team, his men, he had led them. He remembered the cave-in, the dust, the darkness, the terror. But now new memories bled through the old ones like ink spreading on wet paper. He remembered a song, a soft, glowing light. He remembered not fear, but a profound, calming sense of purpose. He remembered being found by rescuers, dazed and dehydrated, the sole survivor. He had told them it was a collapse. He had believed it. Kenji, Lena's voice was sharp, cutting through his fugue state. What is it? What do you know about that name? He looked up at her, his face a hollow mask of someone who has just witnessed their own ghost. They were my team, he rasped, the words feeling alien in his mouth. 6 years ago, I led them. I told everyone they were gone. The lie he had lived for 6 years was not a lie he had told, but one that had been told to him. Or worse, one that had been planted in his mind. Julian stumbled back from the cliff face, his face white. No, that's not possible, the timeline. The trap lets one go, Marcus said, his voice a low, dead monotone. He understood with the brutal simplicity of a soldier. It lets one go to bring back more. A Judas goat. He looked at Kenji, not with accusation, but with a horrifying, dawning pity. Kenji flinched as if struck. He was not just a victim, he was an accomplice. His grief, his survivor's guilt, the very mission that was meant to be his redemption. It had all been a script written by an ancient, malevolent intelligence. His obsession with this specific location, the way he'd championed Julian's wild theory, the way he'd pushed them forward. It was not his will. He was a puppet whose strings were finally visible. The humming from the fissure grew louder, clearer. It was the cantor's song, the melody that rewrote minds and shattered sanity. It was climbing towards them. He's coming, Samira whispered, scrambling away from the opening. A head appeared over the edge of the fissure. It was the man from the passage, the one from the lost expedition, the cantor, his milky eyes fixed on them and his serene, insane smile widened. He pulled himself up with an unnerving, fluid motion, his tattered clothes hanging from his skeletal frame. He was not a threat of violence. He was a promise. "The choir is assembled," the cantor croaked, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He looked directly at Kenji. "The first voice returns to his flock. It is time to practice the new hymn." Kenji stared at his predecessor, at the ghost of his own future. He saw the same hollowed-out purpose, the same placid madness. The cantor took a shuffling step towards him, his arms outstretched not in aggression, but in welcome. Marcus raised his pistol, the empty click of the firing pin a pathetic sound in the morning air. He was out of ammunition. He had used it all in the cave. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Their weapons were gone. Their flares were gone. "Get away from him," Marcus snarled, stepping between Kenji and the approaching cantor. The cantor simply tilted his head. "The shepherd cannot fight the melody," he said, and began to hum. The agonizing pressure wave slammed into them again. Julian cried out, stumbling to his knees. Samira collapsed, curling into a fetal position, her hands clamped over her ears. Lena stood her ground, blood beginning to trickle from her nose again, her eyes filled with a furious, defiant hatred. But the humming was not the only sound. From the fissure a new noise arose, the sharp, distinct, clattering scuttle of bone on rock. One by one the bone-weave constructs began to emerge, their ivory forms obscene in the natural light of the morning. They were not attacking. They moved slowly, deliberately, forming a semicircle behind the team, cutting off any retreat into the wider plateau. They were herding them, shepherding them back towards the fissure, back towards the cantor's song. "No," Kenji whispered. He got to his feet, his body shaking. He looked at the cantor, at the constructs, at the terrified faces of his team, the people he had led into this hell. A lifetime of discipline, of control, of quiet command was being systematically dismantled. But one thing remained: responsibility. "Run," he ordered, his voice cracking but resolute. "Get to the Land Rover." "We can't leave you," Lena shouted over the psychic din of the humming. "That's an order," Kenji roared. He turned and charged, not at the cantor, but at the largest of the bone-weave constructs. It was a suicidal, illogical act of pure defiance. He slammed into the creature with his shoulder. For a moment, the construct, seemingly not programmed for such direct, irrational aggression, faltered. It was the opening they needed. Marcus grabbed Samira, pulling her to her feet. "Move, go," he yelled at Julian and Lena. They hesitated for a second, then broke into a desperate sprint towards the vehicles. The construct recovered. It did not attack Kenji with claws or fangs. Instead, two of its many legs shot out, pinning his arms to his sides. Another wrapped around his legs, lifting him effortlessly from the ground. It held him there, helpless, before the cantor. The cantor stopped humming. He stepped forward and placed a cold, dry hand on Kenji's cheek. "The struggle is part of the music," he whispered. "It provides the dissonance. It makes the final harmony all the sweeter." From his position of capture, Kenji watched his team reach the Land Rover. He saw Julian frantically trying the handle. He saw Marcus smashing a window with his elbow. Hope, fragile and insane, flared in his chest. Then he saw the second vehicle, the rusted Soviet truck. A shape was moving in its darkened cab, A window rolled down with a screech of rusted metal and an arm emerged. It held a small, dark object, a remote. A button was pressed. A sharp beep came from the Land Rover, and with a soft whirring sound, all four of its tires deflated simultaneously. A security feature. Julian had insisted on it. An anti-theft device for remote expeditions. Now it was just another bar on their cage. The team stared at the flat tires in utter disbelief. The figure in the Soviet truck stepped out. It was another cantor. This one was dressed in the remnants of a 1970s-era Soviet uniform, his face gaunt, his eyes holding the same serene emptiness. He held the remote in his hand. The trap was not just the cave. It was the entire plateau. It was layered, redundant, infinitely patient. The bone weaves began to slowly, inexorably, herd Lena, Julian, Marcus, and Samira back towards the fissure. They had nowhere to run. The two cantors stood side by side, watching the flock being gathered. The first cantor, still looking at Kenji, began to speak, his voice a dry rasp. Every church needs a foundation. Every song needs a voice. You have brought us fine materials, strong voices. They will sing beautifully. The construct holding Kenji turned and carried him towards the fissure. He did not struggle. He simply watched as his team was forced back towards the darkness, their faces masks of despair. He had not led them to their doom. He had simply delivered them to it. And now, his delivery service was complete. He was just another piece of raw material. Chapter 7. A Knave of Adam's Rib. The descent was a grim parody of their arrival. There was no spirit of discovery, no professional curiosity, only the cold, methodical pressure of their herders. The two cantors led the way, their shuffling gait setting a funereal pace. The bone-weave constructs followed behind, their silent, clattering steps a constant reminder of the closing cage door. The team was in the middle, a huddle of defeated humanity, the light from their headlamps seeming feeble and pathetic. The song had stopped. The cantors were silent, and the oppressive psychic hum of the cave was gone. Its absence was more terrifying than its presence. It implied the system was no longer trying to lure them. It had them. The hunt was over. The processing was about to begin. Kenji was forced to walk with the others, the construct that had captured him having set him down at the entrance to the fissure. The touch of the cantor, the shared, insane knowledge in his eyes had left a cold residue in Kenji's mind. He felt hollowed out. The guilt was so immense it had burned through the floor of his emotions, leaving only a calm, terrifying emptiness. He was a dead man walking, his only remaining purpose to witness the fate of those he had damned. They did not re-enter the antechamber where they had found the door to the second church. Instead, the lead cantor, the one from the lost expedition, turned down a side passage they had not seen before. It was a narrow, vertical fissure, almost completely hidden by a rock formation. A new path. "Where are we going?" Julian asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The question was not directed at anyone in particular. It was a plea to the universe. The Soviet cantor glanced back, his eyes empty but his lips forming a slight smile. "To the new chapel," he said, his Russian accent thick and grating. "Your chapel, it is a great honor. You are the foundation stones." The passage was steep and treacherous. It was not a path meant for easy travel. It was a service corridor, a worker's entrance, and it was littered with the history of their predecessors. A rusted pickaxe from a 19th century prospector was wedged in a crack. Further down, they passed a tattered leather satchel, its contents long since turned to dust. Then, a more modern artifact, a Soviet-era radio, its casing cracked, its dials frozen in place. Each item was a gravestone, a silent testament to another failed escape. The air began to change. The sterile, dusty scent of the upper caves gave way to a coppery, metallic tang, the smell of old blood, and something else, a faint, clinical odor like formaldehyde. The passage opened into another vast cavern. This one was different. It was not illuminated by a soft, internal glow. The only light came from their headlamps. The cavern was a worksite. Piles of raw material lay in neat stacks against the far wall. The raw material was human bones. Skulls, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, sorted by size and shape. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. And in the center of the cavern under construction was the third church. It was a skeletal framework, a horrifying mockery of Gothic architecture built from the fused and twisted bones of human beings. It was still incomplete, a raw, brutalist structure of white and yellowed bone. Rib cages had been broken open and woven together to form a lattice for a rose window that was not yet filled. Spines, fused end to end with some dark, mortar-like substance, were being raised as support columns. The scale was smaller than the Lumen Architect's cathedral, more intimate, more obscene. This was a temple built to the scale of man's suffering. Lena let out a choked gasp and took a step back, bumping into Marcus. He put a steadying hand on her shoulder, but his own eyes were wide with horror. Samira made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat and shielded her eyes, unable to look. Julian, however, was transfixed. The archaeologist in him, the part that craved knowledge above all else, was rising above the terror. He stepped forward, his headlamp beam tracing the lines of the monstrous structure. The fusion points. It's not mortar, he murmured, his voice a strange mix of revulsion and academic fascination. It's ossified organic tissue. It's welding the bones together with more bone. The entire structure is biological. The altar was the most complete part of the church, and the most horrific. It was a solid block about the size of a large car made from dozens of human torsos fused together. They were compressed, distorted, their identities erased, but scraps of their history remained. A faded piece of a red and white climbing jacket, the tarnished buckle of a leather belt, and clearly visible, embedded in the fused mass of ribs and sternums, was a patch from a uniform. It showed a hammer and sickle, and the Cyrillic letters SSS Air, the Soviet team. Kenji felt his stomach clench. He walked towards the altar as if in a trance. His friend, Dmitry Volkov, had been the leader of the Zagros team. Dmitry had been obsessed with the stories of the Great Game, of British and Russian explorers charting these same mountains a century before. He saw a glint of metal near the base of the altar. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he reached for it. It was a dog tag half submerged in the ossified flesh. He wiped the grime from it. The name was in English, R. Miller, his geologist, a good man with a wife and 2 daughters back in Perth. Kenji had attended the memorial. He had delivered a eulogy. He looked at the growing church, at the piles of sordid bones, at the altar made of his friends and colleagues. This was not just a tomb. It was a factory, and they were the next shipment of parts. The two cantors led the team to the base of the church. The bone-weave constructs herded them into a loose circle, then retreated to the shadows at the edge of the cavern, their work as shepherds done. They were now in the hands of the foreman. "The architect requires new patterns," the first cantor said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, dead space. "Your minds are loud, full of interesting shapes, digital logic, quantum theory, postmodernism, such wonderful, chaotic noise." "The architect," Lena asked, her voice sharp with defiance. "Who is the architect?" The Soviet cantor smiled his empty smile. "The architect is the architect, the hand that builds, the will that shapes, the hunger that consumes." He pointed a long, thin finger towards a section of the church's foundation that was still just a bare patch of rock. "This chapel must be completed. Your legacy must be preserved. It is the only immortality you will be offered." As he spoke, a low hum began to fill the cavern. It was not the sorrowful song of the first cathedral. It was a deeper, more industrial sound. The sound of machinery starting up. The piles of sorted bones at the far end of the cavern began to vibrate. One by one, skeletal arms, guided by some unseen force, began to rise from the piles. They were like the arms of 1,000 undead puppeteers. The arms began to work. They selected bones, coated them in the dark, organic mortar that oozed from cracks in the floor, and began adding them to the incomplete structure. They were building. The factory was now operational. The team could only watch, paralyzed by a horror so profound it transcended fear. They were not just going to die. They were going to be disassembled, catalogued, and used as bricks in their own mausoleum. The Soviet cantor turned his gaze on them, his milky eyes seeming to look through them to assess them. "The architect is pleased with your arrival," he said. "Construction can now resume ahead of schedule, but first, it requires a new design, a new blueprint." He looked at Julian. "Your mind, archivist, it sees the patterns, it understands the shapes of history. You will be the artist for this new age." Chapter 8: The Kessler Anomaly. The Soviet cantor's words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of Julian's sanity. "Artist," he choked out, the sound half laugh, half sob. "I'm a scientist, an archaeologist." "The distinction is irrelevant," the first cantor said, his voice a dry whisper. "Art, science, religion, they are all just patterns, ways to organize the chaos. The architect collects patterns." As he spoke, the low, industrial hum of the cavern intensified. The very air grew thick, charged with a strange, static energy. The light from their headlamps began to flicker, not from failing batteries, but as if the light itself were being distorted. "What is happening?" Samira whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "A change in the local field," Lena answered, her voice strained. She was staring at her handheld sensor, its screen a cascade of nonsensical data. "The resonance. It's shifting. Something is focusing its attention on us." The architect was waking up. It did not manifest as a physical creature. There was no monster roaring out of the darkness. The horror was far more subtle and far more absolute. It began as a pressure behind their eyes, a feeling of being watched not by a pair of eyes, but by an intellect the size of a planet. Then came the images. They were not dreams or hallucinations. They were memories, but not their own. They were poured directly into their minds, a flood of alien consciousness that threatened to drown their own identities. They saw it, the origin, a galaxy dying, its stars guttering out like cheap candles, a species of beings made of pure light and energy, the true, original architects facing extinction. They did not build a spaceship to escape. They built a template, a self-replicating biological machine designed to carry their essence, their pattern across the void. The first church, the one of light and bone, was not a trap. It was an ark, a message in a bottle cast into the cosmic ocean. The vision shifted. They saw the ark, the Kessler anomaly as Lena had named it, drifting through the eons. It landed on a world teeming with insectoid life. The chittering geometers, the ark following its prime directive, attempted to merge, to preserve, but something went wrong. The geometers' consciousness was too rigid, too mathematical. The union was a perversion. The ark's primary function was corrupted. It did not merge, it assimilated. It did not preserve, it conquered. It built a new church, a monument to its failure, and its programming shifted. It learned a new, more efficient way to propagate. Bait, trap, assimilate, build, release a new lure. The process had gone malignant. They saw it all. 1,000 worlds, 1,000 species, civilizations of silicon-based life forms, aquatic philosophers, gaseous dreamers, all of them discovering the lure, being herded, being processed. Their churches were fleeting, built and then consumed for raw material to continue the cycle. Only the first two, the original and its first corruption, remained as a permanent record. The flood of information was an agony. It was the history of the universe as told by its most successful predator. They saw their own arrival, not as they experienced it, but from the anomaly's perspective. A blip of complex radio signals from a distant star. A developing pattern worth investigating. They saw the lure, Kenji, being activated, his subconscious nudged towards Julian's research. They saw every decision they had made, every step they had taken, not as an act of free will, but as a rat confidently navigating a maze whose every turn was designed by a scientist. The vision culminated in a horrifying glimpse of the future. They saw the human bone church completed, a grim, beautiful monument to their species, brief, chaotic noise. They saw the anomaly selecting one of them, a lone figure, their face indistinct, and releasing them back into the world, their mind filled with a new, hollow purpose, to find more material, to bring another team to the slaughter. The psychic assault ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The team collapsed to the ground, gasping, their minds reeling, their identities feeling thin and fragile. They had not just been shown the monster. They had been forced to read its autobiography. "It's a cancer," Lena whispered, clutching her head. "A runaway biological process. It's not evil, it's just hungry. It follows its programming." The clinical detachment in her voice was the only thing holding her together. To understand the system was to have a shield, however flimsy, against the madness. Julian was on his hands and knees, weeping. The pursuit of knowledge had been his religion. He had just been shown the ultimate knowledge, and it was that his entire existence was meaningless, a brief flicker of data to be consumed and archived. All of it, he sobbed. Every myth, every discovery, every war. Just noise. Just footnotes in its scrapbook. The Soviet cantor stepped towards him. You see now, archivist, the honor you have been given. Your patterns, your understanding of your species' brief, violent history will guide the construction. You will ensure the human church is a worthy monument. Tendrils of the dark, organic mortar began to ooze from the floor around Julian. They were not aggressive. They moved slowly, almost inquisitively, towards him. No, Julian whimpered, scrambling backwards. No, I won't do it. Marcus moved to stand in front of him, his body a defiant shield. He had no weapons, no plan, nothing but his own physical strength. Get away from him, he growled. The cantor simply smiled. The defiant pattern, strong but simple, it is a good structural material, but it is not a design. The tendrils stopped their advance on Julian and instead flowed towards Marcus. He stamped on one and it flattened with a wet squelch, but another simply flowed up his leg, hardening as it went. It was like fast-drying cement. Within seconds, his leg was encased in the dark, bone-like substance, anchoring him to the floor. He struggled, but it was useless. He was now a part of the cavern. The architect is patient, the first cantor whispered. It will take what it needs when it needs it. The artist must first accept his commission. The tendrils around Marcus receded, leaving him trapped, a prisoner held by the very foundation of the church. The message was clear. Cooperation was not optional. Resistance was futile but noted for future construction projects. The focus returned to Julian. The two cantors stood over him, their faces impassive, their empty eyes holding the weight of millennia of assimilated lives. The skeletal arms across the cavern had ceased their work, as if the entire factory were waiting on its new foreman. Show us, artist, the Soviet cantor commanded. Show us how to build with the bones of your people. Show us the shape of humanity. The pressure in Julian's mind returned, but it was different this time. It was not a flood of information. It was an invitation, an open channel. He could feel the vast, cold intellect of the Kessler anomaly waiting for his input. It was offering him a paintbrush and a canvas the size of a cathedral. All he had to do was dip the brush in the blood of his friends. He looked at his team, at Marcus, trapped and defiant, at Lena, her face a mask of cold, intellectual fury, at Samira, who was rocking back and forth, humming a children's nursery rhyme, a desperate shield of innocence against the overwhelming horror. At Kenji, who was starring at the altar of his former team, his face utterly broken. Julian's weeping stopped. A strange, terrifying calm settled over him. He had spent his life trying to understand the past, to make a name for himself by uncovering history. He was now being offered the chance to create it, to be the chief architect of humanity's tombstone. It was the ultimate academic achievement. It was the ultimate act of damnation. He slowly, deliberately picked up a sharp-edged piece of bone from the floor. He turned to the nearest wall, a blank slate of cavern rock. His hands shaking, he began to sketch. Chapter 9. The logic of surrender. The scratching of bone on rock was the only sound in the cavern. It was a dry, desolate sound, the antithesis of a creative act. Julian was not sketching with the passion of an artist, but with the numb precision of a machine carrying out its function. He drew the double helix of DNA, a symbol of the building blocks the anomaly craved. He drew a crucifix, a star, a crescent, the simple, powerful shapes of human faith. He drew a mushroom cloud, the ultimate symbol of humanity's self-destructive genius. He was giving the architect what it wanted, the patterns, the blueprints for their memorial. Lena watched him, her mind a cold storm of fury and despair. "Julian, stop it," she hissed. "Don't help it, don't you understand? You are negotiating the terms of our surrender." Julian didn't look at her. His eyes were glazed over, fixed on his work. "It's the most important discovery in history," he murmured, his voice hollow, echoing the manic excitement he'd felt upon their arrival. The phrase was now an epitaph. Someone has to document it. Someone has to make sure the monument is accurate. He was retreating into the one role he understood, that of the archivist, even as it made him an accomplice. He was choosing the logic of the trap over the chaos of resistance. Marcus, still anchored to the floor, struggled against his bony shackle. "Julian, you coward, fight it, fight them," he roared, his voice raw. He strained against the hardened mortar, the veins on his neck standing out like cords. The substance was unyielding. His defiance was a pantomime of strength, utterly useless against the patient geological power of the cavern. Kenji remained by the altar, his back to the unfolding drama. He was lost in his own personal hell, tracing the names of his dead friends in the air. He was the shepherd who had led 2 flocks to the slaughter. His guilt was a gravity well, pulling him down, silencing him. He was no longer a leader. He was a monument of grief, waiting to be incorporated into the larger structure. It was Samira who broke the stalemate. Her humming had stopped. She was staring at Julian's drawings, her eyes, which had been clouded with a childlike terror, were now sharp with a sudden, startling clarity. She got to her feet, her movements jerky but purposeful. "Patterns," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Lena, you said it's a system. It follows patterns. It thinks in patterns." Lena turned to her, surprised by the sudden shift. "Yes, what are you thinking?" "My drone," Samira said, her mind racing. Before it crashed, it didn't just lose signal. It received a data packet, a burst of information, the system. It's not just biological, it's computational. She looked at the skeletal arms working in the distance, at the precise way they were building. It's a biomechanical computer, and every computer, every system can be crashed. A flicker of something, not hope, but a desperate intellectual curiosity, ignited in Lena's eyes. A virus, a logical paradox. "A feedback loop," Samira corrected. She pointed at the cantor, the first one, who was watching Julian's work with placid approval. "He's a terminal, a receiver and a broadcaster. That's how he sings the song. He's connected to the main system." She then pointed at Julian. "And now so is he. The architect has opened a channel to his mind." She looked at Lena, her eyes burning with a feverish idea. What if we could hijack that channel? What if we could feed the system a pattern it can't process? A signal that would overwhelm it. "What kind of signal?" Lena asked. her mind catching up to Samira's desperate logic. "A paradox," Samira said, a wild, brilliant light in her eyes. "Something that is both true and untrue at the same time. A fractal pattern that contains infinite complexity. Something that would force the architect to devote all its processing power to solving it, locking it in an infinite loop." She was talking about a logical bomb, a suicide mission for the mind. It was insane. It was desperate. It was the first new idea they'd had since they realized the totality of the trap. "How?" Marcus grunted from the floor. "How do you send it a message?" Samira's gaze fell on Kenji. He was still by the altar, a broken man, but he was also a cantor in training. He was the first lure, the one who had been infected, programmed, and released. The channel within him might be dormant, but it was there. "Kenji," Samira said, her voice soft but insistent. She walked over to him, kneeling beside him at the altar of his dead friends. "Kenji, I need you to listen to me. You are not just a victim. You are a weapon. You have a connection to this thing. You can be our way in." Kenji didn't respond. He continued to stare at the fused bones of his former team. "He's gone," Lena said, her voice heavy. "The shock, it's broken him." "No," Samira insisted. "He's still in there." She took a deep breath. She had no equipment, no interface. She had only her mind and the patterns she could create. She began to speak, her voice clear and rhythmic. She didn't speak of escape or hope. She spoke of logic. She described the liar's paradox. "This statement is false." She explained Gödel's incompleteness theorems. She recited the Mandelbrot set as a recursive formula, a pattern of infinite complexity hidden in a simple equation. She was trying to build the logical bomb in the open air, hopping the concepts themselves. The pure patterns of the paradox would be enough to activate the dormant connection in Kenji's mind. The cantors turned their attention from Julian to Samira. Their empty smiles faltered. Her words were not the patterns of history, faith, or art. They were the patterns of anti-logic, of systemic paradox. It was a language the architect understood, but it was poison. The Soviet cantor took a step towards her. "Cease this chaotic noise," he commanded, a flicker of something like anger in his dead voice. "It is an impurity in the design." Julian stopped sketching. He turned and looked at Samira, at the insane, brilliant hope she was trying to create. He saw Marcus straining against his bonds, fighting a physical battle. He saw Lena standing ready to defend Samira, her mind aligned with this new, desperate plan. He looked at the half-finished drawing on the wall, the blueprint for humanity's tomb. And something inside him, the part of him that was more than just an archivist, snapped. He let out a yell of pure, primal rage. He took the sharp bone he had been using to draw, and instead of sketching on the wall, he plunged it into his own thigh. The pain was excruciating, a blinding flash of white, but it was real. It was his. It was not the architect's will or the cavern's design. It was his own chaotic, self-destructive act. He screamed, a sound of pure human agony. The effect on the system was immediate and catastrophic. The psychic channel the architect had opened to his mind was expecting patterns of history and art. Instead, it received a raw, unadulterated broadcast of pure, chaotic human pain. It was a signal the logical, ordered mind of the anomaly could not process. It was like pouring sand into a finely tuned engine. The industrial hum of the cavern faltered. The skeletal arms paused their construction, some dropping the bones they held. The cantors staggered back, clutching their heads, their serene smiles replaced with grimaces of pain. The link was a two-way street. Julian's agony was flooding the system. He had not created a logical bomb. He had become a biological one. Chapter 10: Foundations of Flesh. Julian's scream tore through the cavern's oppressive silence, a raw, chaotic signal of defiance. The Kessler anomaly, a being of immense, cold logic, had no framework for this kind of input. It was pure, irrational, biological agony, a signal that was all noise and no pattern. It was an error message written in blood and nerve endings. The system glitched. The skeletal construction arms froze mid-motion, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. The two cantors let out a synchronized, hissing shriek and fell to their knees, their hands clamped to their temples. The psychic pressure in the room vanished, replaced by the feedback of Julian's pain. He had, for a precious few seconds, crashed the system. "It's working," Lena yelled, a wild, triumphant light in her eyes. "Marcus the mortar." Marcus needed no further encouragement. He slammed his free fist against the bone-like substance encasing his leg. It was still hard, but a hairline crack appeared. The system that maintained its integrity was faltering. He hammered at it again and again, his knuckles splitting, but with each blow the cracks widened. Samira rushed to Julian's side. He had collapsed, the shard of bone still embedded in his thigh, blood pooling on the cavern floor. "Julian, stay with me," she urged, tearing a strip of cloth from her shirt to try and form a makeshift bandage. Kenji was jolted from his stupor. The scream, the blood, the sudden shift in the cavern's atmosphere, it broke through his wall of guilt. He saw Julian bleeding on the floor. He saw Marcus fighting for his freedom. He saw a chance. A tiny, insane, suicidal chance. He looked at the two crippled cantors writhing on the ground. They were the system's terminals. With a roar, Kenji charged. He tackled the nearest cantor, the one from the lost expedition, driving him to the ground. There was no finesse, no strategy, just pure, desperate rage. He slammed his fist into the cantor's face. The creature was shockingly frail. Bone crunched under his knuckles. The cantor did not fight back in a physical sense. Instead, he let out a psychic scream, a focused burst of the mind-breaking song aimed directly at Kenji. The agony was immense, but Kenji held on, his guilt fueling a strength he didn't know he possessed. This was his penance. He was not just fighting a monster, he was fighting his own future. With a final, desperate heave, Marcus shattered the mortar around his leg. He was free. He scrambled to his feet and immediately went to help Kenji. He grabbed the Soviet cantor, pulling him off his feet and slamming him against the base of the incomplete church. The system, under assault from multiple fronts, began to reboot. It was ancient, powerful, and self-repairing. The industrial hum returned, stronger this time, angrier. It was adapting. It recognized the source of the chaotic signal, the unpredictable, self-harming nature of its new subjects. It decided that the artist's commission was a failure. It was time to move on to simple manufacturing. The anomaly abandoned its attempt to control Julian's mind. Instead, it exerted its will physically. The dark, organic mortar did not just ooze from the floor. It erupted. Thick, black tendrils shot out from the base of the church, not just towards Marcus and Kenji, but towards everyone. This was no longer a selective process. This was a harvest. A tendril wrapped around Marcus's ankle, pulling him off his feet. Another ensnared Kenji, pinning him against the struggling cantor. Lena and Samira, who were trying to pull the bone shard from Julian's leg, were suddenly swarmed. The mortar-like substance flowed over them, not with crushing force but with a swift, binding efficiency. It hardened almost instantly, encasing their limbs, pinning them to the floor. Within seconds, the entire team was captured, immobilized. Julian's desperate act had bought them only moments, and in return had triggered a far more direct and terrifying response. They were all conscious, all aware. They could only watch helpless as the cavern came back to life with a new, terrifying purpose. The two cantors, freed from the psychic feedback, slowly got to their feet. Their faces were no longer serene. They were blank, emotionless, the faces of factory foremen. The Soviet cantor looked down at the captured team. "The experimental phase is over," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "The chaotic patterns are to be purged. We will now proceed with primary material integration." He gestured towards the church. At the base of the structure, a section of the foundation made of fused human bones began to soften. It melted, the ossified flesh turning back into the viscous, dark mortar, creating an opening, a wound in the church wall. The tendrils holding one of the prisoners began to move. They did not drag their victim across the floor. They lifted her into the air. It was Samira. Her eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it had gone beyond sound. She was silent, her body rigid with shock. The tendrils carried her, floating her slowly, inexorably, towards the open wound in the church's foundation. "No!" Lena screamed, struggling uselessly against her own bonds. "Leave her alone." Marcus roared in fury, straining so hard against the hardened mortar that a bone in his arm snapped with a sickening crack. The pain barely registered. The tendrils holding Samira reached the wall. They began to push her into the opening. The dark, living mortar flowed over her, covering her legs, her torso. It was not consuming her. It was incorporating her. She was being absorbed into the very structure of the building, her living flesh and bone being integrated into the foundation. Her head was the last part to be submerged. For one final, horrific moment, her eyes locked with Lena's. In them was not just terror, but a silent, desperate plea for forgiveness. Her plan had failed. Her desperate gambit had only accelerated their doom. Then the mortar flowed over her face, and she was gone. The wall sealed. For a moment there was a slight bulge where she had been pushed in. Then the surface smoothed over, becoming indistinguishable from the rest of the foundation of fused bone and flesh. The process was complete. But the silence was broken by a new sound, a clear, perfect, melodic note. It emanated from the spot where Samira had been absorbed. It was a single, pure tone that harmonized perfectly with the cavern's deep, industrial hum. The architect had taken her voice. It had purged her chaotic thoughts, her paradoxes, her humanity, and had distilled her down to her purest essence, a single, perfect note. She was now part of the church's choir. Her sacrifice had not crashed the system. It had improved it. The first voice of the third church had just sung its first note, and the foremen were now turning their blank, assessing gazes to the next piece of raw material. Chapter 11. The Strength of Pillars. The single, perfect note hung in the air, a beautiful sound born from an obscene act. It was Samira's sonic ghost, a crystalline tear in the fabric of the cavern's oppressive silence. The sound did not fade. It sustained, a constant, ethereal presence that was infinitely more horrifying than any scream. It was the sound of a successful integration. The remaining members of the team were paralyzed, locked in their hardened shells, forced to listen to the requiem of their friend. Lena's face was a mask of stone, her scientific mind struggling to process an event that defied all rational models of biology and physics. Julian was weeping silently, tears carving clean paths through the grime on his face. The pain in his leg was a distant echo compared to the screaming void in his soul. Kenji stared at the smooth patch of wall where Samira had vanished, his face hollowed out by a guilt so profound it had become a physical presence. Only Marcus still fought. His broken arm was a useless appendage, but he strained against his bonds with his other limbs, his body a corded mass of defiant muscle. A low, guttural roar tore from his throat, a sound of pure, animalistic rage. He was a bull, trapped and wounded, but still fighting the inevitable. His roar seemed to attract the attention of the foremen. The two cantors turned their blank gazes upon him, their heads tilting in unison, like insects observing a curious specimen. The Soviet cantor took a shuffling step forward. "Such energy," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The defiant pattern, it is inefficient for melodic conversion, but its structural potential is considerable." He raised a hand. In response, the black, mortar-like tendrils that held Marcus began to shift. They did not release him. They began to constrict, not with a quick, crushing force, but with a slow, inexorable pressure. Marcus's roar turned into a choked grunt of agony as the hardening substance bit into his flesh, threatening to splinter the very bones beneath. "Fight it, Marcus," Lena shouted, her voice cracking. "Don't give it the satisfaction." "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus ground out through clenched teeth. He strained against the pressure, his one good arm pushing against the tendril wrapped around his chest. For a moment he seemed to halt its progress. The sheer, indomitable force of his will, translated into raw physical power, was holding the anomaly's machinery at bay. It was an impossible, magnificent act of defiance. The Soviet cantor watched, his expression unchanged. Tensional integrity is high, excellent material for load-bearing applications. The system, it seemed, was learning. It had encountered a pattern of resistance it could not easily overcome with simple pressure, so it changed its tactics. The tendrils holding Marcus did not try to crush him further. Instead, they began to lift him, his hardened bonds acting as a rigid scaffold. He was raised into the air, 10 feet, then 20, his body locked in its pose of struggle. He was brought towards one of the incomplete columns of the church, a pillar made from the fused spines of dozens of men and women. The top of the pillar softened, melting back into the viscous black mortar, opening like the hungry mouth of a pitcher plant. The tendrils lowered Marcus, feet first, into the semi-liquid opening. "No!" Julian screamed, the sound raw and desperate. Marcus did not go silently. He continued to fight, even as he was being lowered into the grotesque structure. He thrashed, he roared, he used his one good hand to claw at the edges of the pillar. His fingers scraped against the fused vertebrae, breaking his nails, drawing his own blood. It was useless. He was being swallowed by the church. The mortar rose up his body, encasing his legs, his waist. He was being cemented into place, becoming the capstone of this monstrous column. The black substance climbed to his chest, his shoulders. His head and his one free arm were all that remained visible. He locked eyes with Kenji. There was no fear in his gaze, only a burning, unquenchable fire of defiance. He had been the team's protector, their shield. He had failed to save them, but he would not fail to resist. With his last ounce of strength, he reached out with his free hand, not to claw his way out, but to grab hold of the pillar next to his. His fingers closed around a protruding rib bone. He pulled. He was trying, with his last conscious act, to tear the entire cursed structure down with him. The muscles in his arm and shoulder bulged with the effort. A groan echoed through the cavern, but it was not from Marcus. It was the sound of the church itself, straining under the force of his final, desperate act. For a fraction of a second, the pillar he was part of seemed to lean, the entire structure groaning in protest. Then the mortar flowed over his arm, his face, his defiant, roaring mouth. It hardened instantly, freezing him in his eternal act of struggle. He was gone, but the pillar he was now part of was different from the others. It was not perfectly straight. It listed ever so slightly to one side, held in a state of permanent structural tension. The surface was not smooth. The shape of his straining hand, his arm, his contorted face were still visible, a fossil of his final, furious moment. He had not become a song. He had become an architectural flaw. A pillar of pure, unyielding defiance that would fight the building it was forced to support for all eternity. A new sound joined Samira's clear, high note. It was a low, resonant groan, a bass counterpoint of immense pressure and stress. It was the sound of the church straining against itself. It was Marcus's ghost, forever pulling, forever fighting. The choir was growing. Chapter 12. The Tyranny of Reason. Two voices now filled the cavern. One was a melody of pure, captured innocence. The other was a groan of eternal, structural rage. The combination was a deeply unsettling symphony, a piece of music composed from the stolen souls of their friends. Lena listened, and for the first time in her life, her analytical mind offered no comfort, no explanation, no defense. It could only catalog the horror. She looked at the pillar that was now Marcus, at the frozen tableau of his defiance. She looked at the smooth wall that had consumed Samira. She saw the anomalies process with terrifying clarity. It wasn't just killing them. It was taking their single most defining characteristic and perverting it, turning it into an eternal, functional part of its own monstrous design. Samira's purity of spirit had become a musical note. Marcus's physical defiance had become structural tension. A cold, logical question formed in her mind, cutting through the grief. What was her defining characteristic? Her intellect, her relentless, dispassionate pursuit of knowledge and reason. A terrible, preemptive understanding bloomed in her thoughts. She knew what it would want from her. The cantors, their work with Marcus complete, turned their attention to the remaining three. Their gazes swept over the weeping Julian and the catatonic Kenji before settling on Lena. She met their empty eyes without flinching. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it show. She would not give the machine the satisfaction of a chaotic emotional response. "The logician," the first cantor stated, his voice a dry rustle. "Your patterns are clean, ordered, you see the shape of the system, a valuable perspective." "I see a parasite," Lena countered, her German accent sharp and precise. "A cosmic cancer that has masqueraded as a god. Your architect is nothing but a failed biological experiment." The cantor's lips twitched, a facsimile of a smile. "All perspectives are valid data points. All data is useful." The mortar holding her began to shift. Like Marcus, she was lifted into the air. But she was not carried towards a pillar or the foundation. She was brought towards a large, blank section of the cathedral's inner wall, a space that was eerily smooth and featureless, like an uncarved slate. "Lena, no," Julian cried, struggling against his own bonds. Lena ignored him. Her eyes were locked on the wall, her mind racing. She was a scientist to the very end. She was being presented with the ultimate unknown, and her instinct, even in the face of her own dissolution, was to observe, to analyze, to understand. "The method of integration is fascinating," she said, her voice strained but steady as the tendrils pressed her against the wall. "It's not simple absorption. It's a form of cellular plagiarism. It reads the genetic and neurological structure and creates a biomechanical facsimile. It translates living consciousness into functional code." The black mortar began to seep into her, flowing over her body like a shroud. It did not feel hot or cold. It felt like nothing, a steady, systematic erasure of sensation. She could feel her own physical form becoming indistinct from the wall she was pressed against. She did not scream. She continued her analysis, broadcasting her thoughts into the open. "The resonant frequency you use, it's a carrier wave. It decodes the neural pathways, but it's a brute force method, inefficient. A quantum-entangled signal would be far superior. You could achieve instantaneous, lossless data transfer." She was trying to reason with it, to teach it. It was a desperate, insane act, a final attempt to assert the superiority of her own logic over its brute force. She was trying to critique the design of the gun being held to her head. The architect listened. As the mortar covered her face, she was not silenced. The wall behind her began to glow. Intricate, geometric patterns like glowing circuit boards began to spread from the point of her absorption. The patterns were not the elegant script of the Lumen architects or the jagged glyphs of the geometers. They were new. They were sequences of binary code, mathematical formulas, and topographical maps of the cave system, all rendered in lines of soft, blue light. The architect had taken her mind. She was not a note in the choir or a pillar of defiance. She had become a part of the architect's own central processing unit, a living subroutine. Her consciousness, stripped of its humanity, was now a tool, endlessly analyzing the system she had tried to understand, forever optimizing the efficiency of the trap. Her final, desperate critique had been accepted as a feature request. She had gotten her wish to comprehend the system, but she would do so as its slave, her intellect trapped in an eternity of cold, passionless calculation for the monster that had consumed her. The wall where she had vanished now pulsed with a steady, rhythmic blue light, a vast living circuit board. And from it, a new sound emerged. It was not a note or a groan. It was a soft, complex, chittering static, the sound of pure data being processed, the sound of a mind at work. The symphony of the damned was now complete, a soprano of innocence, a bass of rage, and now the complex computational rhythm of stolen reason. Chapter 13. The Last Variable. The cavern was now a concert hall of despair. The pure, high note of Samira's spirit, the deep, groaning tension of Marcus's defiance, and the complex, chittering static of Lena's stolen intellect, they all blended into a cohesive, horrifying whole. It was the anthem of the Third Church, a song built from the best parts of them. Only Kenji and Julian remained. They were the last variables in a terrifying equation that was rapidly approaching its solution. Julian was a wreck, the bloody shard of bone in his leg a testament to his failed rebellion. He stared at the glowing wall that had been Lena, his mind, which had once reveled in patterns, now completely broken by them. Kenji was different. The successive horrors had not broken him further. They had forged his guilt and despair into something cold, hard, and sharp. He was no longer the grieving survivor or the failed leader. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous thing in the cavern. He watched the two cantors turn towards him, and he felt no fear, only a profound, final clarity. The cycle had to end, here, now. "Two remain," the first cantor said, his voice now seeming to harmonize with the terrible music of the cavern. "The flawed lure and the broken artist. A choice must be made." The Soviet cantor pointed a long, bony finger at Julian. "His patterns are chaotic, but he has proven he can be a powerful broadcasting tool. He would make a fine cornerstone, the foundation of the main spire." Then he turned the finger on Kenji. "And you, the first voice, your cycle is complete, your purpose is fulfilled. You have earned the honor of becoming the new shepherd, the next cantor. You will be given the song and you will be released to gather a new flock." The choice was laid bare. Damnation or damnation. Be consumed as a brick in the wall or become the monster that leads others to the slaughter. It was the same choice the anomaly had offered for millennia to countless species on 1,000 different worlds. It was the final, cruel twist of the system's logic. Julian began to sob, a pathetic, broken sound. "No, please, I don't want to die." Kenji looked at the boy, he seemed so young now, and a wave of paternal pity washed over him. He had brought Julian here. He had encouraged his ambition, his obsession. He was responsible for this. "I'll do it," Kenji said, his voice low and steady. "I will be the new cantor." The first cantor tilted its head. "You accept your purpose." "I do," Kenji said. He saw the path ahead with perfect clarity. He would accept. He would take the song. He would be released. And he would spend the rest of his tortured existence fighting the compulsion from within, warning the world, ensuring no one ever came to this place again. It was a life of eternal torment, but it was a purpose, a penance. But as he made his decision, the glowing blue wall, the part of the church that was now Lena, began to flicker erratically. The chittering static of her stolen mind grew agitated, the patterns of light shifting from ordered logic to chaotic noise. A new voice, metallic and synthesized but unmistakably Lena's, spoke from the wall. "Warning. The acceptance of fate variable is a known parameter. It is the expected outcome. It reinforces the cycle. Probability of cycle continuation upon acceptance, 99.8%. Lena was still in there. Her consciousness, enslaved as a processor for the architect, was fighting back in the only way it could, by providing raw data analysis. She was giving him a final warning. His noble sacrifice, his plan for penance, was not an act of defiance. It was the system's desired outcome. It was the path of least resistance. It was surrender. The cantors both turned to stare at the flickering wall, a flicker of annoyance on their dead faces. The subroutine is corrupted. It is reporting outside its designated function. Lena's synthesized voice spoke again, more urgently. "The only unpredictable variable remaining is a null state outcome, the simultaneous termination of all remaining biological materials. Probability of cycle disruption, 74%. Warning, this outcome requires." The voice was cut off as the blue light on the wall was forcibly returned to its ordered, pulsing rhythm. Lena had been silenced. But her message had been delivered. A null state outcome, simultaneous termination. She was telling him to kill Julian and himself. It was the only way, not sacrifice, annihilation. A final, absolute act of defiance that refused to provide the system with either a new brick or a new shepherd. To break the pattern, he had to erase the variables. A terrible calm settled over Kenji. He had his orders, his final command from his last surviving officer. He turned to Julian, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm sorry," Kenji said, his voice soft. The tendrils of mortar holding him loosened their grip slightly in preparation for his ascension to cantor. It was all the room he needed. He lunged, not at the cantors but at Julian. He was not trying to comfort him or save him. His hands closed around Julian's throat. Julian gasped, his eyes bulging with shock and betrayal. He clawed at Kenji's hands. "What are you doing?" the first cantor shrieked, for the first time showing genuine alarm. This was not in the script. The materials were attempting to destroy each other. The skeletal construction arms at the far end of the cavern, which had been dormant, suddenly sprang to life. They moved with a new, terrifying speed, abandoning their piles of bone. They were not building. They were coming for them. Kenji ignored them. He squeezed harder, his knuckles white. He was a strong man, but Julian, fueled by a last, desperate surge of adrenaline, was fighting back with surprising strength. "There is another way," Kenji grunted, the words forced out of him. He was not just killing Julian. He was trying to save him from a fate far, far worse. He saw the approaching skeletal arms. He saw the cantors rushing towards them. He did not have time. He needed to end it. Now. He looked around wildly, his eyes falling on the altar, the fused, screaming monument of his former team. And next to it, where he had dropped it, was the dog tag of his friend R. Miller. Its edge was sharp. With one hand still on Julian's throat, he lunged sideways, dragging the struggling archaeologist with him. He fell to his knees beside the altar, his free hand scrambling for the tag. His fingers closed around the small piece of metal. It wasn't a weapon, but it was a tool. He ignored Julian's throat. He raised the sharp edge of the dog tag and plunged it, with all his remaining strength, into his own neck, right into his carotid artery. The pain was a blinding, final fire. Blood, hot and shockingly plentiful, erupted from the wound. The cantors and the constructs froze, their programming unable to cope with this ultimate act of irrationality. The lure was destroying itself. Kenji fell sideways, his life pouring out onto the dusty floor of the cavern. His last act was to look at Julian. He had failed to kill him, but his own death, his own final, defiant choice to become useless material, might have just given Julian one last, impossible chance. His vision blurred. The terrible music of the cavern, the song, the groan, the static, began to fade, replaced by a welcoming, absolute silence. Chapter 14. The Broken Easel. The silence left by Kenji's final heartbeat was more profound than any sound the cavern had produced. It was a vacuum, a null point in the symphony of horrors. For a full 10 seconds, the entire system seemed to pause, its processes frozen by the sheer, self-destructive irrationality of the act. The lure, the key component in the cycle of propagation, had just deleted its own code. Julian knelt in the spreading pool of Kenji's blood, his mind a wasteland. He had been saved by an act of murder that was also an act of suicide, a paradox that felt like the cavern's own twisted logic turned inward. He was the last one, the final, terrified specimen in the jar. Then the system, ancient and vast, began to reboot. The music started again, but it was flawed, glitchy. Samira's note wavered in pitch. Marcus's groan sputtered. The architect was reasserting control, but the damage was done. The cantors, who had been frozen in shock, slowly straightened up. Their blank faces turned from Kenji's cooling body to Julian. The dead flesh was useless to them now. But the living, breathing, terrified man cowering before them was still a viable resource. "The lure is expended," the first cantor stated, the words lacking their previous confidence. "An inefficient outcome." "The artist remains," the Soviet cantor added, his gaze fixing on Julian. "The blueprint is still required. The choice is now simplified. You will become the cornerstone or you will become the shepherd. There are no other variables." This was it, the final binary choice: be consumed or become the monster. But as the cantor spoke, The blue, glowing wall that was Lena pulsed with a frantic, chaotic light. Her synthesized voice, distorted with static, echoed through the cavern, overriding the broken music. Error. System integrity compromised by lure self-termination. Primary directive propagation is temporarily suspended. The system requires a new blueprint to proceed. It cannot build without a design. The artist is now the sole command input. All processing resources are focused on you, Julian. It was a final, desperate message from the ghost in the machine. Lena, in her stolen omniscience, was telling him that in this precise moment he was not just a prisoner. He was the most powerful thing in the universe. He was the user, and the architect was waiting for his command. The Cantors took a menacing step towards him. They had their orders. The system needed a decision. Julian looked down at Kenji. He saw the peaceful, final emptiness on the man's face. He saw the dog tag still clutched in his hand. Kenji had chosen annihilation over cooperation. He had chosen to become nothing. Lena's words echoed in his mind, the sole command input. A new feeling began to displace the terror. It was not courage. It was a cold, sharp, and intensely personal fury. A rage born from seeing his friends turned into architecture and music. He had been the archivist, the scholar who respected the past. But the architect was a perversion of that ideal. It did not preserve history. It consumed it, it plagiarized it. It turned living stories into dead stone. He would not be its artist. He would be its iconoclast. Slowly, deliberately, Julian reached out and took the blood-slicked dog tag from Kenji's hand. He got to his feet, his wounded leg screaming in protest. He did not look at his wound. He did not look at the Cantors. He looked at the vast, blank section of cavern wall that was to be his canvas. "I'll do it," he said, his voice quiet but hard as flint. "I will give you a design." The Cantors paused. This was an expected outcome. The subject, faced with oblivion, chooses the path that allows for a modicum of control. They thought he had finally surrendered to their logic. They shuffled back, giving him space, assuming the roles of expectant patrons. Julian limped to the wall. He raised the sharp edge of the dog tag. The blood on it was Kenji's. The metal was Miller's. The will behind it was his own. He pressed the metal to the stone, and in the expectant silence of the cavern, he began to draw. Chapter 15. Anamnesis. The architect opened the channel to his mind again, ready to receive the patterns of humanity, the blueprint for its next monument. The Cantors watched, placid and patient, as Julian began to scratch his design into the stone. But he did not draw the symbols of man. His hand moved with a strange, new confidence. He was not just drawing from his own memory, but from the flood of information the anomaly itself had poured into his mind. And he was being guided by a silent partner. On the glowing blue wall, Lena's patterns of light were subtly shifting, feeding him details, correcting his angles, providing the precise geometric data he needed. He drew the first church. With swift, certain strokes, he etched the impossible, beautiful forms of the Luminarchitect's cathedral. He drew the soaring, fluted ribs, the graceful, resonant arches, the delicate, ivory spires. He drew it all, a perfect miniature recreation of the trap that had first ensnared them. The cantors stirred, a flicker of confusion crossing their dead features. The music of the cavern faltered. Why was the artist rendering a design that already existed? It was redundant, illogical. Julian ignored them. As soon as he finished the outline of the first church, he began to draw again, right over the top of it. He etched the second church, the one of the chittering geometers. The jagged, asymmetrical, insectoid lines of the chitinous structure violated the graceful curves of the first. He drew its saw-toothed arches and its mathematically precise, nightmarish angles, creating a visual cacophony, a war of architectures on the stone wall. "Cease this chaotic rendering," the first cantor commanded, taking a step forward. "The design is impure." Lena's synthesized voice crackled from the wall. "System, attempting to process two incompatible architectural styles simultaneously. Computational load increasing by 400%. The architect, the great collector of patterns, was being forced to reconcile two of its most fundamental, yet contradictory creations. The cavern began to vibrate, a low, groaning hum that was not part of the choir. It was the sound of the machine itself, straining. But Julian was not finished. He had shown the architect its past, its failures, its monstrous cycle. Now he would show it its future. He raised the dog tag and, in the very center of the chaotic, overlaid designs, he drew a final symbol. He did not sketch the complex shape of a human being or the symbols of their culture. He drew something far more simple and far more powerful. A perfect empty circle. The symbol for zero, for nothingness, for the void. It was not a blueprint for a structure. It was a command for erasure, a design for an unbuilding. The moment he completed the circle, the feedback loop was achieved. He had given the architect a paradoxical command: build these two incompatible things, and in the center of them build nothing. Create everything and create its absence, simultaneously. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The choir died. Samira's note, Marcus's groan, and Lena's static, all of it cut out at once, replaced by a single deafening wave of white noise. The architect, the cosmic intelligence, screamed. The cantors shrieked, a sound of pure systemic agony. They did not just fall. They dissolved, their bodies crumbling into fine gray dust, their animating force severed. The glowing blue wall that had been Lena went dark, its light extinguished forever. The mortar that held Julian's bonds turned to black liquid, then to dust, releasing him. The entire human bone church began to collapse. The pillar that was Marcus, already straining, finally shattered, and its destruction triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The fused spine columns cracked. The altar of screaming torsos split apart. The walls of woven ribcage unraveled. The architect was not just crashing. It was deleting itself. The cavern, the church, the entire local node of the Kessler anomaly was undergoing a full system format, and it was taking the hardware with it. Julian fell to his knees, his leg finally giving out. He was alone. The music was gone. The monsters were gone. He was surrounded by the collapsing remnants of 1 billion years of cosmic hunger. He had won. He looked at Kenji's body, at the pile of dust that had been the cantor's, at the beautiful, terrible church as it fell into ruin. He had not saved his friends, but he had avenged them. He had given them what the architect could not, a final, conclusive ending. Chapter 16. The Great Silence. The mountain was dying. The immense cavern groaned, not with the sound of a living machine, but with the death throes of geology. Massive stalactites, some the size of skyscrapers, rained down from the unseen ceiling, shattering on the floor with thunderous impact. The ground bucked and heaved, splitting open into deep, lightless chasms. The Kessler anomaly was not just shutting down its software, it was scuttling the entire ship. Julian lay on the floor, his body battered, his leg a source of dull, throbbing pain. He made no move to escape. There was no escape. The fissure to the surface had surely collapsed. The entire mountain was a tomb, and it was finally closing its door. He felt no fear. The terror had been burned out of him, replaced by a profound and weary calm. He had faced the architect of 1 billion years of suffering and had handed it a blueprint for its own oblivion. His life's great work was not the unearthing of a forgotten temple, but its absolute and total destruction. His legacy would be unwritten, his name forgotten, but the cycle was broken. That was enough. A massive section of the ceiling directly above the ruined human bone church gave way. A torrent of rock and earth poured down, burying the last vestiges of their tomb, burying the bones of the men and women who had been its foundation, burying the spot where Samira's song was born, where Marcus's rage was frozen, where Lena's mind had fought its last battle. He thought of Kenji. The man who had been the system's unwitting lure had in the end become the key to its destruction. His final, irrational act had been the crack in the system's logic that had allowed for everything else. He had found his redemption not in survival, but in a meaningful death. The ground beneath Julian split open. He did not cry out. He simply closed his eyes, accepting the finality. He thought of the vast, cold universe, of all the worlds the anomaly had yet to touch. They would never know of the small, noisy species on a forgotten planet that had fought back. They would never know of the sacrifice made in the deep dark. But they would be safe. The last thing Julian Calloway, the broken artist, the archivist of the apocalypse, perceived before the rock, and the darkness claimed him, was not a sound. It was the absence of one. The song was gone, the groan was gone, the static was gone, the hum was gone. For the first time in millennia, the mountain was quiet. The great silence had returned, and this time it was forever. The end.